is Byron Fulcher. I'm the principal trombonist of the Philharmonia Orchestra, which means every now and again I get to play this instrument, the euphonium, in the orchestra when required. Euphonium means sweet tones, and I think the reason it's called that is because the tubing gradually gets wider as the air progresses around the instrument, which means that the bell is quite big, and even down here the tubes are quite fat, and it makes this very round, velvety, warm sound. You can buy different types of euphonium with different bits of added tubing. So you want one that sounds lovely and rich and mellow, and depending on how much money you want to spend, you could have one with just 3 valves, or you could have one with 4 valves, or you can have one with some extra tubing added, which I think we're going to talk about later. When some people in France patented ideas for valves to be added to brass instruments, it led to a whole explosion in the number of instruments, which included cornet, flugelhorn, tenor horn, baritone, euphonium, tuba. They all were born in the early half of the 19th century. Previously to that, the trumpet and the horn could only play certain notes and bend certain notes, but were not fully chromatic. So after the birth of the euphonium in about 1840, brass bands emerged in the UK and other places, and they included usually 2 euphoniums, 2 baritones, 3 tenor horns, and this whole range of instruments that were quite new, generally referred to as the saxhorn family. This saxhorn family of instruments, which includes the euphonium, is very popular and played all over the UK, but it's particularly popular in the brass band areas. The brass band movement tends to have been born of working class areas, mining districts, areas of heavy industry, such as Cornwall, where I'm from. There's a strong tin and copper mining industry, no longer there, unfortunately. And then Wales and Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Scotland, certain industrial areas are where the brass band and therefore the euphonium are most commonly found. In the orchestra, the euphonium is generally called the tenor tuba, and it only emerged in the orchestra towards the end of the 19th century when it had been around for only a few decades. But composers obviously begun to hear it, maybe in the town band, in the brass band, or in the German band, and they picked certain instruments that they wanted to include in the orchestra. The euphonium, of course, initially had no original music because it was a new instrument, so euphonium players would play solos that they'd borrowed, such as parlour songs or arrangements of opera arias, or maybe folk tunes. I think the first concerto for euphonium was written quite early, but then nothing else for about 100 years until the 1970s. And one of the most significant pieces of repertoire there was the Joseph Horowitz concerto. So the sound on the euphonium is created the same as all other brass instruments by buzzing the lips into this, the mouthpiece, which is connected to the instrument, and this agitates the vibration of the air through the instrument. So when playing all brass instruments, it's always a good idea to take the maximum air in you can all the time. The euphonium, compared to the trombone or the trumpet, because the pipe gets wider, the resistance in the instrument is less, so it takes a lot more air, so the air disappears much more quickly. So it's even more important to take the maximum all the time. Like all brass instruments, the euphonium has a very usable middle range. Obviously, the very extreme high and very extreme low registers become a little more difficult to achieve, but nevertheless, the range is incredibly wide. The fundamental low B flat sounds like this, which is quite low, but there's still notes below that. So that's very low, that's down to a pedal C, and there would be limits to how rapid you could play passages in that area, but certainly long notes and loud notes, very usable. 3 octaves above pedal B flat is a high B flat. Above a high B flat, there's quite a bit more register, but again, it becomes the extreme of the instrument and therefore less useful. If I don't press any vowels or move any slides, I get a range of notes just by manipulating this buzz of the lips. If I then press the middle valve, I'm lowering the pitch of the instrument by semitone. What I'm doing is introducing an extra bit of tubing. If I don't press any valves down, I'm not using any of this tubing that sits on this side here. So I can take these slides out, and it makes no difference if I don't press any valves. If I then press the second valve, the air would come out of here. So without it being connected, it sounds like this. Or the first valve, the air would come out of here. Obviously doesn't work, so I need these to complete the tube. If I press the second valve, as I say, I lower the pitch of the instrument by semitone. If I press the first valve, I lower it by tone. If I press both valves together, I'm introducing this bit and this bit, which add a tone and a semitone together, I get a minor third. I can also get a minor third by just pressing the third valve only. So that tells me that this bit of tubing added to this bit of tubing equals this bit of tubing. If I press the third valve only, I can then still lower it another semitone by pressing the second valve. Or a tone. Or if I press everything, in total, I've lowered the pitch of the instrument by an augmented fourth. So, with the addition of 3 valves, we've got an instrument which is fully chromatic over quite a large range, from concert E below the bass clef stave up to as high as I could play. So that's fully chromatic from that point. To fill in the gap between E and the fundamental B flat, I need the addition of the 4th valve. Then I can play down a little bit further without the 4th valve again. And then to get any lower, which is not very often used, but if needed, I would need the 4th valve again. If I press the 4th valve down, I lower the pitch by a 4th. So the amount of extra tubing I need to lower it by a semitone is more than this allows me to. I need a bit more than this because I've already got an instrument that's gone down a 4th by pressing the 4th valve. And this compensating system was invented, whereby the air is redirected from the 4th valve back through the valves at this point, and then introduces these tiny bits of pipe here, which gives me just a little bit of lowering of the pitch when the 4th valve is depressed and these valves are depressed at the same time. Without the compensating system, those notes would be very, very sharp, so the compensating system is really an improvement of the intonation of the instrument. So these valves are called piston valves. When I press that down, it's pushing a little cylinder up and down its surround and opening and closing the holes to these pipes here. If I take the valve out, it's quite a complicated system of holes. It needs careful relocation, otherwise the holes in the cylinder don't match up with the slides. There are lots of different ways to produce vibrato on a brass instrument. The most common one is just to move the chin a little bit. which I suppose is a little shake of the instrument. Some people do literally shake the instrument. Traditionally, the elbow would do a little waggle sometimes, or even the finger on the valve. So there are lots of different ways that vibrato could be achieved, but the most popular one now is what we call lip vibrato, which is this movement of the chin only. So it's good to practice adding and taking the vibrato off and changing the degree to which the vibrato is used. And the speed, of course. On the trombone, which I play most of the time, you've got lots of options because you can just move the slide in and out quickly, and lots of variations of that. Like all other brass instruments, the euphonium has mutes. These are these funnel-shaped things that affect the sound. This one is made of wood. This is a similar type of mute to the wooden one, only it's made of metal. I play the euphonium occasionally, a few times a year, perhaps a little bit more than most trombonists, because not everyone would choose to play the euphonium. It's got its own peculiarities, things you have to learn. I really enjoy playing the euphonium because of its different sound, its colourful, warm sound. The parts that it generally gets to play in the orchestra are usually quite heavily featured. If you just put one euphonium in a brass section, you probably wouldn't hear the euphonium very much. You'd have to really be listening for it. But when composers write for it in the orchestra, it's usually at times when it's featured as a particular sound, so either solo or in some of these excerpts I'm going to play just a little duet moment, and that's why it's included in the orchestra. Mussorgsky wrote his Pictures at an Exhibition for piano. Many people have arranged this for orchestra, including Maurice Ravel. Maurice Ravel was French, and when he arranged this for orchestra, he put a solo in the tuba. In those days, the tuba was a very much smaller instrument than it tends to be these days, possibly even pitched in C above the euphonium. So it's very common for this extract in the tuba part to be passed over to be played to the tenor tuba or euphonium player, which is usually a trombone player. Bidlow is the name of the movement, and Bidlow is an ox cart. Mussorgsky started this movement with the ox cart very close to us, and then going into the distance. When Ravel arranged this for orchestra, he changed the dynamics so that we're made to imagine that the ox cart is in the far distance and it comes towards us, passes very close to us, and then away into the distance. This movement starts with the tuba solo in the distance, and as it comes closer, the orchestra takes over, and then the tuba solo appears again as the ox cart just passes us. Richard Strauss was a very famous composer and conductor during his lifetime. Don Quixote was a famous Spanish novel written in the early 1600s. Don Quixote is a very noble figure, often pictured on a horse, but his sidekick, his friend, is called Sancho Panza, and he was a much lowlier figure, but important figure in the book. He's usually depicted on a donkey. His name, Panza, means belly, so he's often shown to be a fat chap with a big smile sitting on a donkey. In fact, he has a statue in Madrid like that. He's a fictional character, but he's considered important in the Spanish psyche. In the orchestra, I generally play these extracts with the bass clarinet player. So I often sit in the woodwind section next to the bass clarinet, and we play this cheerful sort of music. Gustav Mahler wrote for the tenor tuba in the beginning of his 7th symphony. On the part it says tenor horn in B flat, which means it must be an instrument of the same pitch as this. But with the variation of the bore size, it's difficult to know exactly what he had in mind, but apparently in different manuscripts it said tenor horn or tenor tube. So generally speaking, I would play this on this instrument. Some people might play it on a baritone or something a little bit more smaller in bore. Gustav Holst wrote for the tenor tuba. I imagine that Gustav Holst probably heard the British brass band and liked the sound of the instrument and included it in his Planet Suite. The American composer Stephen Foster wrote some songs in the early to mid part of the 19th century, and I think these might have been the sort of pieces that were initially played on the euphonium as solos. Not long after the invention of the valved brass instrument in France in the mid-19th century, there became a famous cornet soloist called Jean-Baptiste Arbin. Arbin was the first person to write a method for improving technique on valved brass instruments, and this was done in about the 1870s. And still today, this is considered the Bible to learn all brass instruments. Amongst the many important things included in this method is the air vary, which meant that brass players could improve their technique by playing ever more rapid passages. And these variations were usually made on the type of folk tune that I played a second ago, and they sound a bit like this. This would be the theme. Etc. And then there would be variations. The first variation starts like this. Etc. The next version of the tune is like this. Etc. And then it goes on like that, getting ever increasingly difficult and introducing new techniques such as double tonguing, triple tonguing, etc. And things like that, until we reach the final variation, which I can't really play. This is a feature of gruppetto, whereby the notes of the tune stick out of the texture, and in between the notes of the tune, there's a little turn. So to produce a note on a brass instrument, I buzz the lips. In order to make it sound clear and clean and articulated, I also use the tongue. I imagine that I'm saying the syllables tu or du or da, and this makes the air start with a little punch. In Arbin's method, he introduces new ways of improving, increasing the speed of that, and these are called double tonguing and triple tonguing. So instead of going ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, which there's a limit to how fast anyone can do that. He introduces a ka in between, so taka, 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 which is easier to go quicker. There's also a thing called triple tonguing, which is when we go ta-taka, ta-taka. So in the air vary, different variations feature these different multiple tonguings. Nowadays, there are hundreds of air varies for brass instruments, but they follow a similar pattern, maybe an introduction, the theme of a well-known folk tune or parlour song, opera aria, followed by a first variation that might be in a triplet feature, second variation semiquaver feature, maybe cadenza or a minor variation, and then a very difficult, usually very flashy show-off final finale. An important feature of the brass band world and the brass solo world is competitions in the UK. So soloists would get together and try and compete with each other by playing ever more dexterous and difficult passages to a higher degree, and they'd be judged and would walk off with the prize of the day if they were the best. Usually within an orchestral section, at least one, maybe two people will be prepared to play the euphonium as required. But most often a player would be a singular euphonium player. It wouldn't be such a doubling instrument. But orchestrally it's needed so little that when required it's usually a trombonist that would play it. I grew up playing the trombones in brass bands, so I never played the euphonium, but I heard it many times every week from a young age. It became a necessity when I joined a youth orchestra during my college time, and some repertoire came up that required one, and I was the person chosen to have a go at it. One of my first engagements as a euphonium player was to play Bidlow, the excerpt I demonstrated earlier. In those days, I didn't own a euphonium, so I borrowed one. It wasn't a particularly good instrument, but it was okay. It had been a bit neglected. So when I got it, I oiled the valves to make sure they worked, and I greased all the slides. When I came to play it in one of London's finest orchestras, fortunately in an education concert, not an evening concert, I started the piece. But because I had greased the slides so diligently, they moved wonderfully easily. The problem is, I don't always want them to move that easily. And then when I performed the Bidlow solo, this second valve slide, which is only very short on one side, got blown out with the air pressure, and it sounded a bit like this. At this point, the conductor stopped the movement, turned around to the school children in the audience and said, of course, sometimes the wheel comes off the cart. So to this day, nowadays, I play most of the orchestral excerpts on the euphonium, but I'm really a trombonist. My fingers don't work quite as well as somebody that plays a valve instrument all the time, hence my difficulty with some of the rapid passages of the air varies. But it's a beautiful instrument, and there are so many amazing players on it in that world, the brass band world, that it would take a lifetime for me to achieve that standard.